Hi all, I have another fantastically interesting game from the US Chess Championship. Fabiano Caruana, one of the heavyweights of the tournament, was playing Hikaru Nakamura in round 4. Let's have a look at this game. E4 from Caruana. We have the Sicilian defense. A real fighting game is set. Whenever I see a Sicilian, especially an open Sicilian, I'm generally getting more excited. Knight f3, d6, we see an open Sicilian defense. And this goes into the classic Najdorf variation, this a6, the Najdorf move. Now here, bishop e3 might allow knight g4, and there's a kind of dance as well. If the bishop goes here, the knight goes back. There's even been a quick draw at GM level with this repetition, but here, all this nonsense of knight g4 is ruled out in a committal fashion because Caruana plays f3. So you can play bishop e3 without being harassed. It's a simple way out of this. We see e6, so not e5. This is a kind of shaven Ingham pawn structure, flexible. Usually white has to watch out for black playing d5 or e5 at the right moment, which can liberate black's pieces a little bit. We see bishop e3. And now a very curious move, but which has become more and more standard over the last few years, to see that against this setup, white is often wanting to play g4, expand on the king side later, especially usually after castling queen side. We see a prophylactic move, h5. It comes at some downside. It weakens dark squares, especially the g5 square. In a way, it looks like almost, you could imagine, before it became trendy, it looks like a sort of computerish move just to stop g4, and it looks a bit too crude and committal in terms of pawn structure. But it's been used with great success in many games. Now we see prophylaxis by white now in return on the other side of the board with a4 against b5. So a very, very interesting position, stepping out of normal territory already, really. And things get really, really interesting soon, actually. Knight c6. We see bishop c4. This is quite rare. Usually bishop e2. Apparently in this position, but bishop c4 is really stepping this game into new territories. Queen c7, and there's potentially an attack on the bishop, but we see queen e2 supporting that bishop, and also making way for the possibility of castling queen side. Bishop e7. The thing is, white has played this pawn on a4, so actually it's tempting just to castle kingside here, which is what white plays. Now we see knight e5 hitting that bishop. The bishop drops back. Bishop d7. And this is a really interesting decision now by white. Often the bishop pair is given as a sort of positional advantage to collect when you collect the bishop pair. Now here white plays a forcing move which encourages black to literally grab his bishop pair, but there's other elements of the position like space, the importance of this bishop crossing this diagonal, trying to undermine this pawn chain. We see a very, very interesting move in f4. It's kind of volunteering the dark square bishop, believe it or not, because now black can simply play knight eg4, and it's difficult to move the bishop back now because this diagonal will be quite dangerous in this position. You can imagine even a quick d5 might be possible, and bishop c5 at the right time. So here actually the idea is just to step off this diagonal with the absence of that bishop to be less painful. So giving up the bishop pair, basically. What has white achieved? Black did nab this, knight takes, queen takes, and now queen c5 to try to tie down that knight. Temporary pin, inconveniencing white. We see rook ad1, and around here it seems as though it might have been possible, although looking a little bit scary, for black to consider castling even with the pawn on h5. It might be that black has some resources, because what's the option? Well, this pawn, like this pawn here, is putting off castling, like on that side of the board, but Nakamura tries to put the brakes on f5 here. He plays actually g6, being able to respond to f5 with another option. Now queen e2 unpinning, and with ideas of e5 and f5 on the cards. And you might think this is quite surprising, but black actually castles queenside. So we have a crazy position, because usually out of this opening, white is usually casting on the queen side without an a4, and black is often casting on the king side with or without an h5. But here we have the white king on h1 and the black king on c8. So which king is actually safer here? Black has the bishop pair collected from earlier, but the bishop pair there was an upside that there's more intense pressure now on this pawn chain, and in fact f5 puts the pressure on black's pawn chain now on the king side. So white's still playing on the king side. In amateur games, often when one side castles queenside, it's not the problem of king safety necessarily, but on leaving a pawn like on f2 or f7 unprotected. And here it's like this f7 pawn is actually one of the targets of trying to blast open this diagonal here. So black has to tread carefully, simply not to have his king side collapse. In fact, now we see e5 kicking this knight, goes to f3, but on f3 it does mean that knight g5, that is a sensitive square uncovered by black at the moment, and f7 is already hit here. But now Nakamura plays g takes f5, at least trying to undermine white's central control. And this is the start of what seems to be quite a clever idea now after knight g5 to actually sacrifice the exchange. In this position, black actually plays f4, so it's an exchange sack now, potentially, but not immediately. It's not possible. Knight takes f7, there's bishop g4. We see after rook d3 this possibility of the exchange sack, and yeah, it's just welcomed with king b8 basically. So black sacking the exchange. Yes, it is pretty committal decision, but maybe Nakamura is thinking about his aggressive pawn structure here. He has these aggressive pawns in, and also this h pawn could cause a problem. You can imagine this bishop on this diagonal sometimes being dangerous. So we see white playing knight takes f7 and now h4. So is this enough compensation for black in this position? We see knight takes h8. On knight takes d, I guess bishop takes, and then the bishop could come to this diagonal, so the rook could still be left on h8, because it might be useful for black to have knight h5 to g3 as an idea if given enough time. But here black's not given enough time with knight h5 to g3, which obviously would be more than desirable compensation here. But we see queen f2 challenging the black queen immediately off this very dangerous diagonal. So it's all about time if black can exploit this. The thing is now, this is a very tricky position for black as well. Black's king is not as safe as Howell's is here, because after knight d5, another forcing move, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, white has a very nasty threat now of rook b3 hitting b7. That's a very, very nasty threat. So actually Nakamura's king is feeling the cold winds as well as white's king, but maybe black's king a little bit more in fact. We see this move bishop takes a4, which at least stops rook b3, but a clever response now, rook a3, and this bishop is slightly awkward. This configuration is slightly awkward. It's difficult for black, this position, to kind of wriggle out of this pressure potentially on b7, and also this responsibility of this potentially loose bishop now. We see h3 trying to drum up some play against the white king. Note also this bishop's holding e4 at the moment. If only e4 would drop, but is that going to really happen? The bishop is not just attacking b7, it's defending the center. White plays c3. Not too concerned at the moment about any HG. Queen b5. Yeah, this looks pretty bad news. If the queen went to c5, then white could just take on at e4. Yeah, this bishop does seem like a material liability after b3. Isn't the bishop just trapped here? We see bishop h4. And white is winning more material, it seems, with b takes a4. So just won a piece. Queen d3. Is there enough compensation here? Is there any compensation here? White plays a very clinical crushing move in this position now. Can you guess what white plays in this position if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video starting from now? Okay, the final move of the game, in fact, g3. Yeah, this means actually black's king is getting it in some variations, or even the queen, which is a loose piece. If we look at these variations here, so why did black resign? One example, takes. There's an elegant move here, c4. So if takes, we take the queen. If takes here, black's king is under great pressure after queen b6. That's winning. How does black defend? There's no check here. If here we play rook f8, that f file has been blasted open by that move g3. So that's mating. In fact, there's other ways to skin the cat here as well in this position. I think there's also like queen f6, trying to win the queen in some lines. For example, like this is a technical variation I checked out earlier. Check, and you might think this is crazy, but there's a check here just to win the queen, because bishop takes b7. Yeah, white's position is winning anyway. There's two very interesting variations there. Now, you might think earlier in the game, why is it that black sacrificed the exchange? Well, in some variations there, white was going to end up with a very good light square bishop, so Nakamura was basically trying his chances instead just to generate some compensation, but it never really happened against the white king. It seemed actually, you know, knight d5 was such a powerful move, pointing a bishop at b7, so black's king was actually feeling very unsafe during this game. So yeah, a very, very interesting game, original for where both sides castled basically, and the implications of that. So I think this helps the verdict that black may be pushing things a little bit, castling queenside. Not only, also there's the issue of neglecting light squares on the king side, which is a problem in the shorter term. Then king safety maybe in the longer term, if white tries to open things up there or get pressure. So I hope you got something out of this game. Very, very interesting tactical struggle. Quite brief at 31 moves. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.